for discussion, and I am going to let Jeff field questions. So,
okay. Since I don't know hardly anyone's name, I'll just point at you.
I'm just going to be that guy and ask you for the policy prescription.
Okay. Okay. So, one thing that it's very, as some of you may feel this way, I don't know, Julia probably feels this way. Watching this presidential or any campaign can be very disturbing and very disappointing because a lot of these issues are complicated and complex, and instead everything gets reduced to a lower sticker. And one of the things that the political campaign season seems incapable of dealing with is timing, right? And timing in economic policy, like in so much else, is everything. We have some very serious short-term problems, some very serious medium-term problems, and some very serious long-term problems. And to some extent, the way to address the short-term problems is sort of the opposite of the way to address the medium-term problems. And it's not that complicated, but it doesn't seem to be able to make it into the debate. Here's what I mean. So in the short run, the most important imperative is to avoid falling into a second recession in the case of the US, or to encourage the recovery. Right? This has been a very, very weak recovery. And we are really at risk of having a second dip in the recession. So that's the short-term concern. Now, in that context in the US, Europe has a different set of problems, but in that context in the US, I think it's important to understand the financial, debt-related aspects of the weakness of the recovery. Going back to what I was saying before about creditors and debtors being hamstrung by the debt overhang. The most important imperative is to do something effectively to reduce the real debt burden. That could mean a variety of things. It could mean some restructuring of debts. The Obama administration has a couple of very small programs which have only been taken up in a couple hundred of these. We have something on the order of 20 million mortgages that need to be restructured. Now, it's very hard to imagine restructuring 20 million mortgages. I have to say that Menzie and I have a couple of pieces in which we have, I think at the time we thought very controversially said, the easiest way to do this is to run 3 or 4% inflation for the next 4 or 5 years, because that reduces the real debt burden pretty quickly, about 15 or 20%. It turned out to be not so controversial because the Fed effectively, although they haven't said this publicly, the Fed effectively has committed itself to doing that. Right? The latest commitment on the Fed policy is saying that they will continue to keep interest rates effectively at 0 until unemployment, they didn't say it this way, but until unemployment gets down around 6%, is essentially saying we're going to let prices continue to rise until the economy has recovered. So on the monetary policy front, there has been movement in this direction. But actually one of the disturbing features of the current scene is because fiscal policy is gridlocked, both in the European Union and the US, all the weight of economic policy making is falling on monetary policy. And you cannot deal with the crisis of this magnitude solely with monetary policy. So there are a number of interesting proposals out there to encourage the perhaps forcible restructuring of consumer debt. But that's what has to happen, either through inflation or through a forcible restructuring. And it's, there's a reason there are bankruptcy courts. Bankruptcy courts are in the interest of creditors and debtors. If a company is in grave difficulty, of course the company doesn't want to go out of business, and the creditors don't want the company to go out of business. They'd much rather have the company restore itself and get, restructure its debts, because of course a little bit of something is better than all of nothing. So there has to be, and there are, as I say, there are a bunch of proposals out there to try to deal with this, whether in nominal or real terms. So that's in the short, if we could speak about the pie in the sky kinds of things, there's a very strong argument for some form of fiscal stimulus, especially targeted at homeowners. Now, how far that's going to go in the current political atmosphere, we know. I was going to say we don't know. We do know. But that's the short-term task, however you want to slice and dice it, is to try to shore up the recovery. The medium-term task is to deal with the underlying fiscal problems that got us here. And, yes, it's true in the immediate sense that 2001, 2003 tax cuts were serious mistakes, I think. Not mistakes, they led to serious problems. They may have been done on purpose and done for the purpose, but they led to serious problems. We have to restore the federal government's fiscal position. Looking out 10, 15, 20 years, we know what's on the horizon. And there are demographic facts that tell us that if we keep going along the fiscal path that we're going on, and I'm not talking about the deficits that are associated with the recession. Most of the deficits that we're now running are associated with the recession. I'm talking about things happening 10, 12, 15 years from now. We know that we're heading for a brick wall. So something has to be done about that. I think almost everyone agrees that the tax code has to be reformed. Almost everyone agrees that revenues have to be increased. And almost everyone agrees that at some level spending in certain categories has to be restrained. Or to put it, I mean, you don't have to necessarily buy into that. All you have to buy into is the notion that after far too many years, some might say decades, of Americans getting used to a government that provides what they want, provides the services they want without them paying for it, that's got to come to an end. Right? It doesn't matter what it is that voters want. They could want, in terms of social policies or national defense or anything else, homeland security, but the times that we could count on being able to run massive deficits and finance them are over. They're over for one of two reasons, either because the appetite for that debt domestically has just gone way down politically, which it has, or because at some point the foreigners who have been financing that debt are going to start wondering about the solvency of the federal government. So the medium-term challenge is to deal with the fiscal stance of the federal government and to overcome a 30-year pattern of unsustainable deficits. The long-term problem is that I think most would agree the U.S., especially given the experience of the past decade, has gotten itself in a position where it has substantially underinvested in both private sector and public sector activities that are essential to maintain its competitiveness in world markets. Competitiveness, by competitiveness, I just mean the ability of American producers to maintain both the standard of living that Americans want and to compete in world markets. The two areas that I think, again, are sort of consensual about where we've fallen flat is we have a seriously decayed economic infrastructure, whether it's transport, communications, telecommunications, things like that, ports, and that we have an educational system that really, I'm not sure I'd call it failing, but large parts of which are not producing the workforce that's necessary for a 21st century economy. Now, one way of thinking about this, which maybe Julie will remember from when we used to talk about debt crises in the developing world, when I talked to undergraduates about how it happens in the aftermath of a debt crisis, so there are typically three phases of recovery from a debt crisis. There's stabilization, adjustment, and reform. Stabilization means stop the bleeding, keep the economy from collapsing and try to get it back on a growth path. Adjustment is deal with the underlying imbalances that led to the crisis. And reform means change the way the economy is running structurally so that it doesn't have reasons to fall back into the patterns of the previous maladjustment. And I would say that basically that's what confronts us. We are in the stabilization phase. Once we come out of the recession, however long that takes, we're still going to have to face adjustment. We're going to have to face the necessity to deal with the underlying imbalances that caused the crisis. And then we have to deal with the longer-term problems that the U.S. economy faces, all of which are daunting politically, but technically, like I said, this NPR story, the kinds of things they were saying, just to give you an example of the policies, just eliminate the mortgage interest deduction, right? Impose a VAT, zero out the corporate tax, and replace it with a wealth tax. These are all things that, we can talk about all these. These are all things that economists would agree. These are much better ways of running a modern economy, but they're not politically feasible.